Good morning, everybody. Shavua Tov.
Good morning. Shavua Tov, Rabbi.
Good, nice to see everybody. You all have the text, friends. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's begin. Okay. Ricky, good morning. Are you there? Can you read for us? Can you start us? Can you begin our journey?
Yes, Rabbi. Yes.
Please.
1 second. Choosing our mission. A pillar of faith. The Rambam writes, every person is fit to be righteous like Moishe, our teacher, or wicked like Yerovam.
So let me just tell you who Yerovam was. Yerovam, the son of Nevat, Yerovam ben Nevat, is touted as often the symbol of the ultimate transgressor, because not only did he transgress, but he caused others, an entire people, to follow him. Just briefly, the story is he was the one that led the rebellion against King Solomon and caused the breakaway. I mean, a tragedy of immense proportions, a divide amongst the Jewish people, a breakaway northern kingdom, and the consequences of that rebellion we still feel to this very day. The lost 10 tribes. It's a great and colossal national tragedy perpetuated by Yerovam. He started it all. Now, mind you, he started with good intentions. He felt that King Solomon was taxing the people excessively and wasn't fair, and what have you. So he is the archetypal sinner, because in the words of our sages, he sinned and caused others to sin, caused others to go astray. And that's the worst transgression. It's one thing for a person individually to sin, but to be the cause for others to transgress is far more heinous, far more serious. So here the contrast. Moishe Rabbeinu, of course, is the contrast to that. Not only the great, loyal, devoted, and humble servant of God, but the teacher and the inspirer of the Jewish people also to this very day. So there's the contrast. And the Rambam is saying then, when talking about free choice, who does he pick? Moses, Moishe Rabbeinu, and Yerovam. Please continue.
There is no one who compels him, decrees upon him, or leads him to either of these two paths. Instead, it is he on his own initiative and thought who tends to the path he desires. This principle is a fundamental concept and a pillar on which rests the Torah and its commandments, as it is written, behold, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. That is, the choice is yours. Any one of the mortal acts which a person desires to do, he may, whether good or evil. The Creator does not compel or decree that people should do either good or bad. Instead, everything is left to their own choice.
Right, that's the end of quote from the Rambam. Let's read the next paragraph too, which is the author's summary.
God did not create man to be an automaton. Instead, he gave him free choice, which distinguishes him from all other forms of life. All other existence is ruled by the laws of nature. Man, by contrast, has the power to control his conduct and act according to his own initiative.
Thank you. Now, the fact, of course, is that this truism is difficult to understand. There are many questions that one might ask, but I don't see that is the theme of this talk. But I will just address one question, a common question, and that is, if God knows the future, then what choice do we have? The simple answer to that question is God knows the future, meaning God knows what we're going to choose. So what determines the future that God knows now is our choice. To make that perhaps simpler, God is beyond time. So for us, there's not yesterday and there's now and there's tomorrow. But God has a panorama of life where past, present, and future is all now. So therefore, his knowledge in the present, for him, the present and the future and the past is all one. So what I'm saying is his knowledge doesn't determine my choice. My choice determines his knowledge. Because he sees now what I'm going to choose, because he's beyond time, so he knows my choice. But that knowledge, that awareness that he has, who created that? Who determined that? Me, in my free choice. So that's the answer to that classic question. If God knows the future, it's all written, as it were, then where's their free choice? So you just heard the answer to that. There are other more profound objections or problems that need to be understood to appreciate how we can have free choice, which we're not going to deal with now. I'll just tell you that I did deliver a lecture on the subject a number of years ago. Some of you probably attended it. If you want to explore it, you can go online, chabad.org, and just search for free choice and my name. The lecture will come up. It was, I think it's an hour or so lecture, maybe a little bit longer. It was very well attended at the time. And it deals with this subject on a very deep level. I'll just warn you, from experience, because of the nature of the subject, you would have to listen to the lecture probably more than once, probably 3 times, to appreciate the nuance, because I'm condensing it in a very short time. And it's a very, very profound subject and question and answer. So I'm not saying because it's me. I mean, what I'm conveying is very deep and nuanced and requires listening more than once to grasp the nuance. So by all means, go ahead. That is not the subject, however, of this class, I can see, but rather just the nature of our choice, 2 types of choice. Okay, Rika, I'll ask you to continue reading, given that I don't see a lot of readers this morning. Okay, so go ahead.
2 types of choice. The exercise of free choice lies at the heart of our divine service. We have the option of carrying out God's will or ignoring it, heaven forbid. Our challenge is to choose life, living our lives as he desires them to be led. In particular, 2 types of positive choice are expected of us. A, obedience to the mitzvahs of the Torah. God has given us a multifaceted set of deeds which we are obligated to perform, and others which we are forbidden to perform. At times, doing the deeds required of us or observing the prohibitions imposed upon us involves inner conflict, for the doing or not doing may run contrary to our natural tendencies and desires. Our power of choice enables us to control and negate any inner obstacles that hinder the fulfillment of God's will.
All right, so in summary, he's saying that the commandments require discipline, commandments, observance, loyalty to God's commandments requires that often we do what we don't want to naturally do, or we withhold ourselves from doing something we'd like to do. We're all prone to, we have an animal soul, which means a human selfish soul, and our natural instinct, our natural conscious instinct, not our superconscious instinct, but natural constant instinct is we want fulfillment, we want it now, and if you have it and I like it, I want to take it from you, whether by justified means or not, to cite one example. So choice means this, that notwithstanding any inner conflict, any resistance, I have the ability to behave appropriately. What you're hearing now is, from the Torah perspective, there's no such excuse Well, there is an excuse, but it's not a valid excuse to say, I couldn't help myself. I wanted to. I was overcome with lust, with desire, with jealousy, with envy, and I couldn't control myself. Torah says you can control yourself. That's the power of free choice. You can control yourself at all times and do the right thing, or not to do that which you are not to do. That's the first area of free choice. The second one, B.
Molding one's character to conform to God's will, even when there is no explicit commandment to do so. To explain, there is an entire realm of activities referred to as reshus, what is permitted. We are not told what we must do, nor what we must avoid, but that does not mean there is no godly mode of conduct appropriate for these activities. The initiative, however, is ours. We must strive to discover God's will and then shape our characters accordingly.
So what does he say? The distinction. A was the black and white commandments. God says, do this. God says, don't do that. Observe Shabbos, give tzedakah, honor your parents, to cite 3 examples. Don't steal. Don't transgress the Shabbos, to use the example of Shabbos. Any other of the 365 prohibitions. So A was black and white. Here's the list of the rules of the conduct of life. And no matter what your inner turmoil is, you have the ability to do the right thing. The second thing is much more subtle. There are many areas in life that there's no direct commandment. No direct commandment. In terms of discourse between human discourse or between man and God, there's no direct commandment. And so there's a whole array of choices, and none of them are prohibited or commanded. Here too, God expects us, this is a higher level, to refine ourselves such that even in the area of permissibility, we make the divine choice. And that's a much deeper level of a much deeper level of exercising free choice. It isn't a matter of following the rule book. It's about, this is a gray area, this is an open area. And just to cite an example that just comes to mind immediately.
Eating food?
Yeah, eating food.
Permitted foods.
I'm sorry?
Eating permitted foods, but perhaps overindulgence.
That's right. That's one example. Good. Being indulgent. There's no prohibition. The Torah says do not be indulgent in eating and so on. But a person chooses to refine himself and to eat or herself only that which is required for health and not to indulge. That's one area. Another area that comes to mind, and people can suggest things, is, for example, the following. Nowhere in the Torah does it say, explicitly in the Torah, our sages, say this, because the sages in Pirkei Avot particularly, ethics of our fathers and other works, they address B, those areas which are not commandments. So one example is nowhere in the Torah does it say that you have to greet your fellow with a smile and be the first one to greet. So there's no commandment. That's you can come in, to shul or to the workplace, minding your own business with a glum look on your face, and you have not transgressed anything. But this is the second area where a person is required or it's expected of him or her to learn Torah so deeply that even in those areas where it's not spelled out black and white, you do the right thing. As our sages, they spell it out for us. Not everything, but many areas. A person has to greet every other person with a smiling countenance and be the first to greet. Or another area. It doesn't say in anywhere the 613 commandments not to judge your fellow. There's no such commandment. Don't judge your fellow. But that's a higher level that God expects us to arrive at through our own refinement and our own appreciation of Torah and what God wants. And so our sages spell that out in Pirkei Avot. That's like this text, Ethics of Our Fathers, addresses B. It's all a mode of conduct that's not in the Torah outright, but the sages have expressed it because for us as goals to aspire to, do not judge your fellow. Mind you, gossip is in the Torah. That's in one of the 613. It's forbidden to speak ill of another person. We're talking when it's true. If it's not true, that's another prohibition. You're a darn liar. But even when you're not a liar, and you're saying something that's true, that's prohibited in the Torah. But the Torah didn't leave that for our own discovery. That's how serious that is. It's one of the 613. But B is talking about, in our example right now, not only are you not speaking Lashon Hara, you're not thinking Lashon Hara. It's not your focus to gloat and think about somebody else's failure. That's not a commandment. That's a higher level, but we have free choice there as well. We have free choice to make it clear, the two levels. Not only we have free choice to follow the rule book, which is the Torah, the 613, but you also have free choice to develop a sensitivity to what's right on even a more subtle level where we're not even commanded. That's a higher level of refinement. And we have a choice to refine ourselves or not, or remain stuck in our selfish and think negatively and be glum and be angry, whatever, all the things. Like there's no one in the Torah that says don't be angry. There's no such commandment, don't be angry. But that is a higher level of conduct which we have choice over. To be angry or not angry. That's more difficult than the first area, which is about practicality. Do, don't do. This B is not do, don't do. B is much more internal. Attitude, what you think, the attitude, the way you engage between man and man and man and God, not in areas of actual prohibitions. You didn't transgress anything, but you're still a miserable person. There's nowhere in the Torah that says, don't be a miserable person. But that's the second level that God says, I'm leaving it up to you. Here are the basic rules, but I want you to go even more and develop a refined character and attitude and personality and disposition that goes beyond the actual prohibitions and commandments which you get arrested for. Actually, in Torah, there's no jail, but you're accountable for all this punishment. The other areas, you're not going to be punished if you're a miserable person, but you do have a choice not to be. That's a higher level. You follow what I'm saying? The first area is practical. The second one is more attitude, disposition, demeanor. There too, we have a free choice, and it's more difficult. Because we're all born with different characters. Some people just by nature are jealous. They're the jealous types. Some people are just born with, with glum. They have a negative attitude towards everything. Everything is bad and no good. So what we're learning now is we have a choice to change that. That's more difficult, but you can change attitude. You can become a cheery, positive, non-judgmental person, even if it's not your nature. We have choice even in that. This is huge because psychology doesn't agree with that. This is your nature. This is your nature. You're born this way. Torah says no. You're born with a certain disposition, but through hard work and toil, a person can refine his personality or her personality. That's more difficult. B is much more difficult than A. A is just practical. Do, don't do. Say, don't say. Go, don't go. Stay, go. That's easy. But B is more internal, but there's choice there as well. Please continue, Ricky.
These two thrusts are reflected in the Mishnah. Make his will your will, so that he may fulfill your will as though it were his will. Set aside your will because of his will, so that he may set aside the will of others before your will.
It's a very cryptic statement, but let's see the commentary. Continue.
Setting aside your will because of his will refers to the challenge of foregoing one's own desires in order to obey God's commandments.
So the first part of that statement is talking about obedience on the practical level. Set aside your will because of his. But then it said at the end, continue, make his will your will.
Making his will your will refers...
You go on. Yeah.
Making his will your will refers to a greater challenge the molding of one's character so that it reflects and expresses God's will, even in situations where God's command is not specific.
All right, so I hope that's clear. The quote from the Mishnah said, set aside your will. What's that talking about? It's talking about at the practical level. You want to steal that? Don't, because God says don't. Fine. You want to hang on to every dollar that you earn because you claim title to it? God says, no, you got to give 10% to tzedakah. That's practical. You write the check or you give the credit card number. That's practical. The second half of the statement, which is mold your will, make his will your own. That's referring to not the practical area of life, but the inner area of life. Again, attitude, character trait, what you think, your aspirations, etc. I'm not talking about specific commandments, but a general state of refinement. It's one thing not to speak Lashon Hara. It's another thing not even to think about the other person in a negative way. That's a much more difficult task, which he's going to make, the point he's going to make in the next section. Thank you, Ricky. Anne, good morning. Would you read for us, taking the initiative, please?
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Taking the initiative, the task of molding one's character represents a more complete expression of our potential for free choice.
Why? Because it's more difficult. To work on our character, to work on our responses, to work on our attitudes, as opposed to just working on our practical behavior, that is more difficult, more challenging, and it therefore expresses deeper our free choice. God granted us free choice to such a degree that we can even choose what our disposition, what kind of person we want to be, or we ought to be. It's deeper. Continue.
When a commandment has been given, even though man has the option of obeying or not obeying, the fact that God has given the command spurs obedience, for every Jew has a natural desire to serve God.
Right. He's adding a metaphysical thing. When God comes out and says, do this, don't do this, the fact that he commanded it is already a motivation, consciously or not consciously, to behave. So it's not such a huge challenge. I mean, God said, it is a challenge, but not as great as God never said. I don't see it explicit. That's more difficult. Continue. Moreover, continuing.
Moreover, when God's will is explicit, the choice facing man is clear.
It's clear. So you know that if you do this, you're going to get rewarded. If you don't, you're going to be punished. So everybody wants to be rewarded, not punished. It's easier. It's easier when God spells it out. On the other hand, continue.
On the other hand, when God has not given an explicit command, and man has to elevate and refine himself until he appreciates what is expected of him, the challenge and the choice are far more encompassing.
Yeah, let's continue. Read one more.
A new phase. This approach to divine service represents the new dimension contributed by this week's Torah reading. The reading begins, Shalach lecha, you may send. Rashi explains that the people had come to Moshe with a request that spies be sent to explore Eretz Yisrael, and that Moshe had brought their request to God. God had replied, it's up to you. I am not commanding you. If you desire, send.
All right. Thank you. So what is he saying? He's saying the second area of free choice, which is in the domain of the permissible. It could go this way, it could go that way. You're not given a specific commandment. That's the subject matter of this week's Torah portion. Why? Because what's the story here? The Jews have received the Torah. They've spent almost a year at Mount Sinai studying it, and they're ready to go into the land. What happens? The people say, well, one second. Before we go in, we want to send in scouts to ascertain the terrain, and the method of conquest. So Moishe brings this to Hashem, and he says, this is what the people want. God didn't say send in scouts or spies. It was their idea. Hashem's response, up to you. It's up to you. I'm not commanding. It's up to you. So here is a very dramatic area of, it's not a commandment. You could or you could not. You could just go straight in without the scouts preceding or send the scouts before. And God said, it's up to you. So this is a whole, till now it was like black and white. Here are commandments, do, don't do. Now all of a sudden there's an area where the people are choosing a path which is open because they weren't given directives one way or another. So continue. This represents
a new phase in our people's relationship with God. Previously, the Torah had related the commandments when God had given Moishe for the conduct of the Jewish people. It also described certain situations, e.g., the second opportunity to offer the Paschal sacrifice.
Paschal.
Paschal. In answer to a query relayed by Moishe to God.
So what he's saying is, till now in the Torah, we were dealing with God's commandments. Even, in other words, it comes directly from God, black and white, from above to below. Even the Paschal, the second Passover, which we're not going to go into right now, which we learned about, which came from the people. But nonetheless, it's not the same as this week's Torah portion, because the query came from them to God. Should we, what do we do? And God answered. So it's still coming from above, even though it's initiated by the people. What's happening, however, now in this parsha is a whole new domain where it's to begin with and to end with, it starts and ends with the people. Our decision. He concludes, but even in those instances, the story of the Paschal Lamb, God responded. Continue.
God responded with an explicit command.
Oh.
This is the first occasion in which God leaves the choice to Moishe.
Yeah, so he's saying this week's Torah portion begins a whole new, you have to appreciate, friends. The Jewish people are just born. We're beginning our whole journey. We're getting the commandments. So what are we being told now? Up until this week's Torah portion, it was A. Now we're added B. A is commandments. God says what to do. God tells you what not to do. That's stage one. This week begins a whole new stage. There's many areas in life, we identified many examples moments ago, where there's not one commandment one way or another. You have to choose through your inner refinement. That's what begins this week's Torah portion in the story of the scouts. The people want to send, God says, up to you. I'm not telling you. I'm not going to dictate this. This has to come from you. This is a new approach. This is a new level. I'm not abandoning the old one. The rules are still the rules. But in addition to the rules, there's a whole area in life. It's not a commandment one way or another. And it's expected of us to choose wisely and the right thing, which is always about being selfless for the most part. Thank you. Ethel, would you read, please, building God's dwelling? Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Building God's dwelling. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. This new approach to divine service, that the initiative be given to man, is associated with the objective of the spy's mission, our people's entry into Eretz Israel. The goal of life in Eretz Israel is to fashion a dwelling for God within the realities of everyday experience. More particularly, this dwelling should be established by man's initiative. Were the dwelling to be established by revelation from above, it would be incomplete. Man, as he exists within his own context, and the power of creativity he possesses, would not be reflected within it. When, by contrast, man transforms his own will, and on the basis of this inner metamorphosis proceeds to transform his surroundings, God comes to dwell within our existence.
Okay, what is he saying in simple language? He's saying this second phase or stage, which means it's not a question of simple obedience to the commandments, but rather it's a question of investing my own self in the relationship, even in those areas where it's not a commandment one way or another. That is when we make the world and ourselves a home for God. To explain, to use the model of a marriage. The first elemental component of a marriage is the commitment and obedience and loyalty to the other. Your wife asks you to do something, your husband asks you, then you are committed to do so. Your wife or your husband says, please don't do this, then you respect that. If that's not present, then there's no foundation. The foundation has to be, dear, what do you want? What is it that you don't want? And I'm committed to fulfill that. But that's not enough. That's not the stuff of a relationship where one party dictates to the other how to behave. It's one way. I'm surrendering to your will, which is nice. But you don't just want my surrender, you want me. You don't just want my obedience. The husband doesn't, it's easy the other way because it's truer the other way. The wife, because she understands relationships better than he does. The wife doesn't just want the husband's obedience, following the instructions. She wants his heart. She wants him. So even in those areas where she doesn't spell it out, he does the right thing. He's devoted. In other words, a relationship is in the small, casual moments of life. Is there sensitivity there? Are you devoted there? You didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't wrong. You didn't transgress one of my edicts, but you just weren't present. If that's missing, it's not a marriage. You're not a soldier in the army. A soldier in the army just needs one. A, not B. Here are the rules, follow the rules. But a marriage isn't the soldier in the army. A marriage is not just, I'm giving you my behavior. You tell me what you want, and I'll do it. And you tell me you don't want, I won't do it. That's not a marriage. A marriage is a meeting of hearts, of souls, of minds. You've got to give yourself. So even in those areas where she doesn't dictate what you're supposed to do, he does the right thing. He says the right thing. He's present. And it's in details and in nuance. That's a marriage. And that happens now with this in our story of the Parsha. Why is stage 2 happening now? Because now they're going into Israel. And now they're building a home together, man and God, the Jewish people and God. They're building the home. They're going to build a temple in Jerusalem. They're going to make Israel a home for God. So now only is when the second stage begins. God says, I've given you the commandments. That's it. There's going to be a whole area of life where it's going to be your choice. And that's the stuff of our deepest connection. So it kicks in now, not in the desert, but when they're about to go into the land of Israel. The end was they weren't ready. It was delayed 40 years. They weren't ready for that relationship. 40 years later, they were finally ready. All right? So that is the essence. We're going to stop here.